Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives 1, McDuff Lives 3, and on Facebook we are simply McDuff. And good to see you all. Hi, Corky, Nadia, William, and Sergeant Stadenko. How's everybody doing? And it's another Monday morning here in Mystery Island, and it's a very beautiful day today. Looking forward to getting back out and doing a little gardening today. You should see my corn plants. They really have jumped up, and I'm very happy to see them growing very well. It's been a bit of a struggle with the kale. I haven't figured out why my kale won't grow, but I'll sort it out sooner or later. You can't do everything at once, you know. You have to take things in your stride. You have to do it, when you can. And just like any type of gardening, you get used to the idea of weeds are going to be there. There's just going to be weeds. And so, what are you going to do about it? Ah, well, we're. I'm looking forward to getting into Anton Chaitkin's writing generally, and in particular, this book called Treason in America, which he put together back in 1984. So, as we start investigating Chaitkin's work here, Treason in America, from Aaron Burr to Averil Harriman, and that last part ought to intrigue you if you're a fan of sorting out the reality of our country's government and how it's been subverted. Um, but we're going to start at the beginning because I think in the beginning of this book we get something else that's a very valuable, and that is an insight into Lyndon LaRouche in his stride and his prime when he was taking on public figures such as McGeorge Bundy. And so I'm going to go ahead and jump into the introduction here, where as soon as I get it up there it is. And okay, so the book is called Treason in America, from Aaron Burr to Averil Harriman, published 1984. And it's not in print. It's hard to find a copy. I do not have a copy, but I did get from Executive Employment, Executive Intelligence Review, EIR, an electronic copy, a Kindle copy. So you can download a PDF, as I did, for $9.95, and you can just go to the Schiller Institute website, and you'll find a button there for their books for sale, and just sort through that. There's a number of books that they have offered, but this one's not in print, so you just best you can do is to get, as I did, the Kindle version. There is an introduction by the author Anton Chaitkin. Because I just can't read everything, I'm going to skip that and get right to the introduction by Lyndon H. LaRouche Jr. Its caption is Up McGeorge Bundy's Family Tree. And here comes LaRouche. According to the celebrated Harvard economist John Kenneth Galbraith, McGeorge Bundy was secretly elected, quote, the head of the U.S. establishment, unquote, back in 1965. Bundy had richly earned the appointment. As head of the National Security Council under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, he had done about as much to destroy the United States as any man in that post conceivably could, and was therefore a candidate for a much higher position of power and responsibility as head of the powerful Ford Foundation. Since spring 1968, Bundy had never liked this writer very much. By his lights, he had reasons for this growing enmity. A handful of the writer's associates made a fair mess of an insurrectionary project Bundy had afoot at that time, and later did damage to Bundy's funding of an effort to detonate anti Semitic race riots in New York City. Since then, the two of us have come afoul of one another more or less constantly, a circumstance efficiently calculated to foster mutual dislike. Admittedly, since Henry A. Kissinger unleashed the first of his international covert operations against me in 1975, it is Kissinger's personal vendetta against me and my friends, including a few who have died after a Kissinger threat was delivered, which has been off and on in the headlines around the world. In this matter and other notable affairs, Bundy is vastly more important in rank and capacity for sheer meanness than the unhappy Mr. Kissinger. The roots of the differences between Bundy and myself go back deep into the 19th century. By family background and present political profession, I am a Henry Clay Whig, whereas Bundy's roots and convictions are those of the Lowells of New England. We patriots of the early 19th century never liked the Lowells, the Russells, the Cushings, the Perkinses, the Higginses, or their friends and friend and accomplice, Aaron Burr. We had reasons. Those, quote, New England Federalists of Hartford Convention notoriety made their fortunes in the slave trade, the China opium trade, and above all, outright damnable treason. The New England Blue Bloods returned the sentiment when they weren't distracted by such enterprises as hiring fellows around Harvard University or elsewhere to cook up a cheerfully falsified official version of their family's history. Looking at Mr. Bundy today, we are tempted to the view that perhaps certain family political traits are a matter of breeding. Alas, Anton Chaitkin's survey of what the New England families could not manage to have covered over by the industrious gentlemen of Harvard, Princeton, and Yale is not going to increase Mr. Bundy's affection for me and my friends. So be it. The very thought of being within the orbit of Mr. Bundy's affections would cause me to shudder no end. These fellows of Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, and a touch of Groton tossed in here and there, consider themselves, quote, the best families. It is said by the press, which they largely own, that these self-styled American patricians are, quote, eminently respectable, unquote. Why should they not be respectable? How many Chinese died to make them respectable? How many women and children died of virtual slavery in the Lowell's New England textile monopoly? And how many black slaves on southern plantations to produce the cheap cotton by whose profits the Lowells greatly enlarged their, quote, respectability? How many fishermen of Newburyport and Gloucester died in eternal pursuit of the haddock and cod, all to give the same Lowells the more respectability? How many Americans gave us their lives in the War of 1861 to 65 because of the New England crowds plotting with the Carolina slaveholders to split the United States into several balkanized provinces in a failed effort to make such folk as the Lowells even far more respectable than they are today? Can we be so inconsiderate to those countless dead as to deny that their blood made the fine gentleman families of Harvard, Princeton, and Yale so very, very respectable? Shall we permit the loutish traditions of Dr. Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, our quaint, un-British conceit, the natural political equality of persons, to blind us to the plain and simple historical fact that these celebrated families are not only passing respectable, but full well bloody respectable? By all the saints of holy Hesiod, and by all the fine traditions of the Theban phalanx and Sparta's Lycurgus, we must not blind ourselves to the simple fact which one can read plainly enough and often enough in the unimpeachable pages of the New York Times. These families are, quote, damned respectable, unquote. Even the helots of our nation admire the Spartan respectability of fellows such as McGeorge, Bundy, We may take this from none less than the voice of labor itself, AFL-CIO President Lane Kirkland. Do not permit yourselves to be distracted by the respectable Mr. Kirkland's membership in Henry A. Kissinger's Trilateral Commission, or Mr. Kirkland's creative financial ventures in the Caribbean real estate speculation. He is, after all, the certified voice of labor and a great, true Democrat. Would he not have been sponsored by so faithful a servant of democracy as that stalwart Fabian, former General Secretary of the Communist Party and one-time professed servant of Joseph Stalin's OGPU, J. Lovestone? Do not seek to persuade Mr. Kirkland otherwise by showing him that these families played both sides in the War of 1812 or the devastating War of 1861 to 1865. You will not fool Mr. Kirkland on this point. He knows that it was only brutal aggression which prompted the United States to suppress the institution of black chattel slavery, and has said so more than once. Mr. Kirkland's knowledge on the matter is unshakable. It was his ancestor, after all, who directed the firing on Fort Sumter. Do not raise your voice to allege that it is these gentlemen of Harvard, Princeton, and Yale who have ruined our nation's economy and defense during most of the recent 20 years. You must admire the fact that they have done so successfully, as respectable people should. As for this fellow, LaRouche, he is merely a disgruntled Whig who keeps dragging out unpleasant facts which almost no one, believe me, none of my friends, quote unquote, wishes to hear. Despite all that, there are a few disgruntled people here and there in the United States and some other parts of the world who wish to know how these damnably respectable gentlemen families of Harvard, Princeton, and Yale came to walk in the imperial footsteps of the celebrated second Earl of Shelburne and the ways of the great Tiberius before him. Since the families in question have not yet successfully destroyed the entirety of the records of their ancestors' doings, the time has come to present these surviving facts to the disgruntled before such evidence vanishes in some eminently respectable fire. Well, there's the introduction, and I think that was a pretty fiery introduction to the book by Lyndon LaRouche, who is quite fired up indeed. And it's good, because I am too. I think we need to adopt this attitude of skepticism towards our history books and openness toward the iconoclasm of a Lyndon LaRouche who wants to take down the bad idols and hopefully supplant them with new and better ones. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Mark. Mobster, Tiberius Barr. Very good. Hello, Osprey, says Jimmy Beam, and oh, we're glad to have you with us too, Jimmy. Corky, Holly, of course you're an Osprey too, Jimmy, over there, and you're in Britain somewhere. I know that. Not quite sure where. Okay, now into Anton Chaitkin's text, and I will just read from it. I hope you guys enjoy the reading. Part 1 is called The British Swiss Secret Service in North America. Yes, a shout out to Sean Ross. And here is Swissy present at the beginning. Chapter 1, Benedict Arnold re-examined. On August 24th, 1814, invading British armies entered Washington, D.C., and burned the Capitol, the White House, and the other government buildings in a classic demonstration of the, quote, arrogance of power, unquote. But for the astonishing valor and intelligence of America's tiny navy during that Second War of Independence, 1812 to 1815, the United States would likely have ceased to exist. The country was defenseless. Its financial, industrial, and military power had been systematically stripped away since 1801, just as today, with demolished auto, steel, rail, port, and housing industries, the nation is vulnerable to our military and economic rivals and financially terrorized by the Swiss and British through Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve. So then, the country had been deliberately steered away from the nation building, strong government policies of Washington and Hamilton and made weak, the object of contempt and ridicule by the enemies of freedom who applauded the U.S. budget cuts. It is time to put to rest the notion that fiscal austerity or cutbacks to pay debt are somehow American answers to growing deficits. These policies were smuggled into the United States by our foreign enemies and were imposed on the country in a coordinated attempt to end the American Republic. That this is literally true and a precise description of events in the first quarter century of our national independence will be shown here. Alexander Hamilton's founding policies for the United States, a national bank providing cheap credit for productive enterprise, national sponsorship for the building of roads, canals, harbors, and later railroads, and government protection of developing industries from the British trade war, also known as competition, continued the tradition of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the French finance minister under Louis XIV. The Congress enacted these policies, and America assumed its place among the powers of the earth. But the founders were displaced from power. Hamilton was killed, and his policies reversed by a British-Swiss secret intelligence organization, among whose principal American agents were Vice President Aaron Burr and Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin. Facing bankruptcy as a result of the losing worldwide conflict with America and threatened with global emulation of the American Republican experiment, the British Empire responded by organizing a campaign to subvert enemy governments. The USA must be reconquered. The oligarchs vowed France must be destroyed and Spanish America must be captured before being lost to independent republicanism. The campaign was directed by William Petty, Earl of Shelburne, whose new British Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, represented an alliance of noble families of Switzerland, Scotland, and England. The eyes and the arms of this apparatus were provided by the British East India Company. Company Chairman George Baring's family, along with the Hopes, were the Anglo-Dutch financial power. Shelburne and Baring used the company to employ a legion of, quote, theorists, unquote, including Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, and Thomas Malthus. They controlled an elite army of spies and assassins, based primarily in Geneva. We will present here the simple, direct evidence that Burr and Gallatin were not Americans, but British agents based in this Genevan assassin nobility. Aaron Burr and Benedict Arnold. Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton. Later, he was tried for treason after leading a mercenary army against the United States. He was acquitted in that trial because the existing evidence was not presented to the jury. Burr fled the country under state indictments for murder and treason, only to return, have all charges quietly dropped, and become a rich New York lawyer. All Burr biographies speculate on the, quote, psychological drives which may have motivated his adventures. No book in existence today raises even a question that Burr may have been a spy. As for Gallatin, who migrated to America and spent a lifetime trying to destroy the country. No biography even hints of base motives. On July 11th, 1982, the anniversary of Hamilton's shooting. Now, I have to stop. This is my speed bump. I got to, whoa, wait a minute. July 11th is today. So the anniversary of Hamilton's shooting is the same day that I start reading this book about Hamilton. Remarkable. The New York Times carried a major reassessment of Burr's guilt on that day, July 11th, 1982. Quote from the New York Times, the indictment of Aaron Burr for treason 175 years ago proved to be the final blow to the former vice president's reputation and political career, even though he was found not guilty of the charge. Now, a scholar contends that a coded letter implicating Burr, excuse me, pardon me, a coded letter implicating Burr and long believed to have been written by him was in fact written by an associate. That letter supposedly showed that Burr was planning to seize Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mexico for his own undefined political purposes. And it was that letter that persuaded President Thomas Jefferson to issue a warrant for Burr's arrest. Citing handwriting analysis, the scholar contends that the letter was written by Jonathan Dayton. That's Dayton, like the city in Ohio. Burr was probably guilty of something, but no one's absolutely sure of what. Burr was close to a nervous breakdown, quote unquote. Why doesn't the New York Times attempt to resurrect Aaron Burr and in effect celebrate the anniversary of Burr's murder of Hamilton? Interesting. This is him connecting Aaron Burr to the New York Times today. And I think this is the kind of exercise that helps us a lot to see the arc of various things through 200 years. To answer this question is to unlock crucial secrets of American history, secrets which have remained so only because of the self-imposed blindness of historians for more than a century. And it will reveal the deeper significance of the Times' backing for the austerity policies of today's Albert Gallatin's, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, and the Swiss-based international monetary powers. Aaron Burr's maternal grandparents were the famous anti-rationalist theologian Jonathan Edwards and Sarah Pierrepont, whose family intermarried with the J.P. Morgans, later the owners of the New York Times. Taking an extreme form of the anti-free will doctrine of Geneva's John Calvin as his starting point, Edwards was at the same time an apostle of the British determinist philosophers Hobbes, Locke, and Hume. The result was a particularly savage notion of man, forced to submit blindly to the capricious will of an incomprehensible God. A counterpole to the ideas of progress expressed by the Pilgrim Fathers, Edwards was applauded as America's greatest original mind by the royal reactionaries of Europe. Burr's father, Aaron Burr Sr., visited Edwards as a disciple and married his daughter, Esther. The family scene was one of chaotic terror. Two of Esther's sisters, Burr's aunts, were institutionalized for insanity, and one murdered her own daughter. An uncle of Edwards slashed his own throat at the height of an Edwards revival frenzy. Aaron Burr Jr. was born in Newark, New Jersey in 1756. His parents both died in his infancy, and the orphan boy was taken to live with family friends who were prominent merchants, the Shippens of Philadelphia. His stepsister in this household, Margaret Peggy Shippen, became the wife and instigator of the world's most famous trader, Benedict Arnold. Later, while living with his uncle, Burr was tutored by Tapping Reeve in marksmanship and the arts of diplomacy, rhetoric, and dissimulation. He attended Princeton University, then called the College of New Jersey, from 1769 to 1772. His father had been the second president of the college, his grandfather the third. As the political conflict with the British grew, the sympathies of the students were largely with the American cause. Burr's classmate James Madison and others joined the Patriot Whig Society. But Burr marked himself for the attention of nervous British authorities. He organized the Cliosophic Society, that's Cliosophic, in opposition to the Whigs. Reciting cynical British poetry, Burr and his students, followers, spent their nights in bars and brothels, their days scoffing at the more politically inclined. Among those who must have taken a particular interest in the young nihilist was the high-ranking British military officer in New Jersey, James Mark Prevost. James Prevost and two brothers had left Geneva, Switzerland in the 1750s to enter the British service. They had been army officers in the French and Indian War. The Prevost family in Geneva were hereditary members of the ruling Council of 200. Abraham Prevost was principal of the University of Geneva during the American Revolution. In England and in Switzerland, the Prevosts were intermarried with the Malays. The Malay Prevosts, who lived as a single extended family, will form the most important link in this story of assassins sent against America. And it was the Prevost family, as we shall see, who finally gave the orphan Aaron Burr a home and identity. Following his Princeton career, Burr re-immersed himself in grandfather Jonathan Edwards's, quote, new light visions by enrolling in a theological school taught by another Edwards disciple in Connecticut. At the end of 9 months of this religious training, Burr stole a horse and rode to Litchfield to be tutored again by his shooting teacher, Tapping Reeve. Reeve taught Burr the basics of British law, and with Burr as his first student, Reeve went on to establish the first law school in America. Tapping Reeve, now married to Burr's sister Sally, trained 2 generations of positivists and aspiring oligarchs from the southern plantations and the New England shipping and slave trading families. Sally Burr Reeve was one of the countless women who served Aaron Burr as efficient instruments, like a glove through which Burr could reach out and handle his agents and dupes. Aaron Burr joins the Army. The tradition of 2 centuries of history says that Aaron Burr was a daring American soldier, a hero of the Revolution. No biographer contradicts this estimation. Let the reader decide the value of the tradition. While at the Litchfield Law School, Burr struck up an intense friendship with Dolly Quincy, then the fiancée of Continental Congress leader John Hancock. Miss Quincy was passing the summer at the home of one of Burr's cousins, who was Hancock's friend. When war broke out at Lexington and Concord, Aaron Burr went to Philadelphia, carrying Dolly's recommendation, and secured from John Hancock, by then her husband, a letter of introduction to the commander of the Continental Army, George Washington. Burr went back to Boston in the summer of 1775, suddenly ablaze with patriotism. The American army was camped outside the enemy-occupied city. Burr presented Hancock's letter to General Washington, who took one look at the applicant and denied Burr's request for a commission. But Burr did not leave. While Washington fought desperately to whip his undisciplined ranks into a combat force, Burr wandered on and off the post, flashing his Hancock letter. After 2 months of this, Burr found a way around Washington's watchful eye. An expedition of 1,200 soldiers had set out on the march to Quebec under the leadership of Colonel Benedict Arnold. Burr walked 60 miles north of camp to meet the expedition. He had no commission. He was a, quote, gentleman volunteer. He said he would pay his own way, and he was accepted by Arnold. The first of Burr's revolutionary exploits entered the history books on the basis of Burr's testimony alone. Colonel Arnold wanted to link up with General Richard Montgomery's forces over 100 miles away, moving toward Quebec after conquering Montreal. Arnold sent Burr as a messenger, and Burr's account of what happened is reported without comment by biographer Holmes Alexander. Quote, in order to traverse the strange, hostile, that is, British-controlled territory, Aaron devised an ingenious plan. He disguised himself as a priest, affected a college patois of French and Latin, and guilelessly presented himself at a nearby monastery. Here, prevailing upon the Holy Father for assistance, he obtained a guide who brought him swiftly to Montgomery's camp. Quote, unquote. Is this a true story? Before rejecting it as absurd, consider it as possible partial truth from the fact that the Catholic Church in Canada, largely Jesuit controlled, had reached an agreement with the British authorities to cooperate with British rule while being allowed to maintain their religion and French language. In any case, somehow Burr was escorted in the manner and comfort of a royal guest through enemy territory and arrived at the camp of General Montgomery, who was so dazzled with Burr's apparent ingenuity that he made him a captain and an aide de camp. Montgomery now joined Arnold's forces to prepare the final assault on Quebec, and Burr got the assignment he had sought, to be a spy and scout behind enemy lines. In the closing pages of the first full-fledged Burr biography, Englishman James Parton harks back to a scene in preparation for the attack. Quote, during the expedition to Canada, while the American forces lay near the heights of Quebec, Burr went down to a small brook to take a drink. Having no cup, he was proceeding to use the top of his cap as a drinking vessel when a British officer, who had come to the other side of the brook for the same purpose, saluted him politely and offered him the use of his hunting cup. Burr accepted the offer, and the two enemies entered into conversation. The officer, pleased with the frank and gallant bearing of the youth, concluded the interview by giving Burr part of a horse's tongue. They inquired each other's name. Quote, when next we meet, said the Briton, it will be as enemies, but if we should ever come together after the war is over, let us know each other better. Stepping upon some stones in the middle of the brook, they shook hands and parted. In the subsequent operations of the war, each saw the other occasionally, but before the peace, the British officer went home, badly wounded. 36 years after, when Colonel Burr was in exile in Scotland, he met that officer again. Unquote. When the Montgomery-Arnold forces finally launched what was supposed to be a surprise attack on the fortress of Quebec, the British had somehow learned of the plan, the timing, and the place of the attack. The Americans were slaughtered. Canada was lost to remain a British base of subversive operations against the USA. But in the crushing defeat, Burr emerged a hero. One of Burr's followers from Princeton had also joined the expedition as a chaplain, and his story was circulated by the rumor mills to Congress. General Montgomery was shot dead inside the fort, and all others who had gone inside lay dead or dying except Burr. He walked over and picked up the body of the general, and the British stopped firing as he walked out of the fort with it in honor of such a noble and courageous act. Arnold refused to give up the attempt on Quebec. He stayed through the winter and gathered more forces from the lower colonies. But in May 1776, Aaron Burr simply deserted and went to New York. One of his cousins had obtained for him an appointment to Washington's staff. Burr left behind him a newfound friend and correspondent in the Arnold camp, General James Wilkinson, whose career as an enemy agent later intertwined with Burr's at many crucial points. Burr arrived at Washington's New York headquarters with a hero's reputation and took up his duties as secretary to the commander-in-chief, assigned to copy the most crucial military secrets. Within a few days, Washington fired Burr. As biographer Milton Lomask puts it, quote, some sprightly tales have been written of Burr's service, how he examined documents meant only for the general's eyes. There is reason to believe that something happened between Washington and Burr during the latter's short stay at Richmond Hill headquarters. Something that, were we to know its nature, might explain Washington's frequently ungracious treatment of Burr in the years to come. Clearly, something in the manner of the younger man annoyed the older one. Perhaps it was Burr's innate air of superiority, derived from his family background. Upon Burr's complaint, John Hancock got him transferred to the command of General Putnam. Burr bullied his way to a promotion by disobeying orders and making bold sallies in contempt of senior officers, with sometimes pretty but always inconsequential results. In the winter of 1777, Washington's troops were holed up in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, ragged, cold, and weary. Colonel Aaron Burr, with a retinue of spies and scouts, was hanging around the fringes of British-occupied New York. Burr wrote to Washington asking him to send his 2,000 best troops for Burr to lead in a final assault on New York City. Washington responded by ordering that Burr's troops be merged into his command in Pennsylvania. But Burr and his immediate circle were never cold, hungry, or ill-clothed at Valley Forge. They were supplied with the best of everything by the British. Burr and his men would often reappear in camp, plump and dressed in their finest. On occasion, Burr would quiet the mumblings by distributing a small part of these goods to the camp. Burr explained that his spies kept him informed of where the British supply caravans would be passing through. His stocks, he said, came from raiding these British wagons. A few miles south, the British Army occupied Philadelphia. Among the most prominent Tories who came out to gala parties of the British officers was Aaron Burr's stepsister, Peggy Shippen. At one famous dance, the Mischianza, she appeared with her boyfriend, Major John Andre, Adjutant General of the British Army. Major Andre, born in London, was the son of a Geneva, Switzerland merchant banker. John was sent from London to Geneva to receive his training in military and related arts at the University of Geneva during the late 1760s. Now, in Philadelphia, Major Andre and Miss Shippen were preparing what would be American history's most famous treason. At the same time, Burr, now an American colonel, began making visits to New Jersey home of British Captain James Mark Prevost, who was in the South fighting the Americans. James's brother Augustine was by then the commander of British forces in the South, and he and James became governor and lieutenant governor of Georgia after it was reconquered by the British. Burr was visiting Mrs. Prevost, whom he was later to marry, who introduced him to the works and world of Jeremy Bentham and Voltaire. These were no mere literary favorites of Theodosia Prevost. Bentham was then living on the estate of British intelligence overlord Shelburne, sharing in the work of controlling agents around the world, and Voltaire was an acquaintance of Mrs. Prevost's brother-in-law, General Augustin Prevost, from as early as 1767. Jacques Mallet Dupin, the founder of the British branch of the Mallet family, began his association with Voltaire in 1770, frequently visiting his residence outside Geneva until Voltaire's death in 1778. In 1772, on Voltaire's recommendation, Mallet Dupin became a professor of history in the German province ruled by the Landgrave of Hesse, who within a few years was to sell his people to King George to be mercenaries against America. Mallet Dupin's services to British intelligence will be noted later. In April 1778, Burr requested a transfer to the staff of General Horatio Gates. The, quote, Conway cabal of anti-Washington political and military men had made Gates their intended replacement for commander-in-chief. While they circulated slanders against Washington, Gates refused the commander's orders to move south with his troops to Washington's assistance. General Gates's chief aide and secretary was General James Wilkinson, Burr's confidant from the Canada expedition. Doubly confirmed in his suspicions, Washington squelched Burr's request to join Gates. In spring of 1779, Benedict Arnold and Peggy Shippen were married, and the first letters negotiating Arnold's treason conduited through his wife went between Arnold and Major Andre. Meanwhile, Aaron Burr, closely watched by George Washington, finally got himself transferred out of the area by contracting, quote, nervous fatigue, unquote. Burr's contacts arranged that he be assigned to supervise the activities of espionage agents, whom Burr regularly sent to New York to, quote, study British shipping in the enemy capital. In 1778, September, Burr transferred to West Point, the crucial fortress on the Hudson which blocked the British Navy's passage north from New York City and guarded the American connections between New England and the southern colonies. Burr had 2 to 4 months there to study the fort's layout and its defenders. In January 1779, Burr transferred to White Plains, just north of the city. From this base, he rode every night down to the British lines. The official story was that he used the knowledge gained to plan raids against enemy outposts. The Benedict Arnold plot came to its climax in September 1780. Peggy Shippen Arnold left Philadelphia to be with her husband for the planned surrender of West Point, whose command Arnold had succeeded in obtaining. On her way, she stopped in Paramus, New Jersey, to confer with Mrs. Prevost. When the conspiracy collapsed, Andre and his assistant Joshua Hett Smith were captured. Arnold fled to the British, and his wife play-acted her way past Alexander Hamilton's interrogation. On her first day out of West Point, Mrs. Arnold stopped again at the Prevost mansion. Matthew Davis, longtime aide and finally executor for Aaron Burr, wrote in his 1836 edition of Burr's memoirs, quote, Mrs. Prevost was known as the wife of a British officer and connected with the Royalists. In her, therefore, Mrs. Arnold could confide. As soon as they were left alone, Mrs. Arnold became tranquilized and assured Mrs. Prevost that she was heartily sick of the theatrics she was exhibiting. She stated that she had corresponded with the British commander, that she was disgusted with the American cause and those who had the management of public affairs, and that, through great persuasion and unceasing perseverance, she had ultimately brought the general into an arrangement to surrender West Point to the British. Aaron Burr and the Escape of the Traitors. On this visit, Theodosia's boyfriend, Aaron Burr, was also present. The Shippen family complained in a bitter historical record, never printed until 1900, that Aaron Burr, in this post-West Point encounter, made sexual advances to Mrs. Arnold, which she repulsed. The Shippens conjectured what Burr's line must have been, that he would now take care of her, that after all he had promised her parents, his own step-parents, that he would look after her in the future. Benedict Arnold's accomplice was Joshua Hett Smith, in whose coat Major John Andre was captured, was arrested and held for trial. He admitted that he had brought Andre from the British ship Vulture for his meeting with Arnold, which took place in his house, that he had hidden Andre in his house, and that he had provided him with a disguise and conducted him toward New York, the plans of West Point hidden in Andre's clothes. In the words of George Washington, Smith was to be prosecuted, quote, for aiding and assisting Benedict Arnold, late a major general in our service, in a combination with the enemy to take, kill, and seize such of the loyal citizens or soldiers of these United States as were in garrison at West Point and its dependencies. Joshua Hett Smith was acquitted at the court-martial on the pretext that he was only obeying Benedict Arnold, but he was held for a civilian trial on similar charges. While he was being transported as a prisoner to another court, the convoy stopped at the home of his brother, Thomas Smith. Aaron Burr was there. Burr succeeded in delaying the party overnight and tried various stratagems to stall their progress longer, but they moved on. Later, however, while awaiting his civilian trial, Joshua Smith escaped from custody, fled to New York, and thence to London, where he lived in the comfort and grace of his nephew's family, the Malays. At the point of Joshua Smith's escape, Aaron Burr, having resigned from the army, was studying law in that very same home of Thomas Smith, Esquire, who is described by biographer Milton Lomask as, quote, a respected figure in the profession. George Washington thought otherwise, however. Washington noted that the discovery that Thomas Smith had been seen behind enemy lines after Arnold's treason, quote, may, added to the other circumstances of a suspicious nature, furnish the legislature with good reasons for removing the gentleman in question from Haverstraw, which, from its vicinity to our posts, affords him an opportunity of gaining and giving intelligence very material to the enemy and injurious to us. Of his dispositions to do this, there is little doubt, unquote. As for Benedict Arnold, he came back into action leading British troops who were burning American villages along the James River. Somewhat earlier, further south and equally infamous, the commander and subcommander of raiding and burning British forces had been General Augustine Prevost and Colonel Mark Prevost, respectively, the brother-in-law and husband of Aaron Burr's sometime girlfriend. Major Andre was hanged for his role in Arnold's treason. Historians today still mourn his unfortunate, unquote, end, a spy's death being an indignity for someone of Andre's breeding. But Andre's family did well, merged into the de Neuflies family, and joining the Malays, they formed the de Neuflies Schlumberger Malay Bank, NSM Bank, now known to the world as the Schlumberger Financial and Intelligence Interests. Aaron Burr married Mrs. Theodosia Prevost in July 1782 after being informed that her husband had died while on tour with the British Army. He was now a husband, stepfather, cousin, and uncle of Malay Prevosts in many very important places. Well, I am stopping at this point at the end of chapter 1, so that's a good place to stop. And just a couple of comments. Interested in your thoughts on this. The amount of references to Swiss in this chapter is just overwhelming. And it's unlike most accounts I've ever read, except for Sean Ross's consistent emphasis upon Swissy being, the real force behind the curtain. Is this connection to the Malay Prevost family not clear yet? I think it's very, very clear, and I'm surprised that I never heard of it before. Before reading this book, I had no idea of the importance of Geneva to the actors in the very first case of treason, that of Benedict Arnold, and how connected they are to the British nobility. The idea that English, Scottish, and Swiss combined together to create a financially secure future for themselves. I hadn't read it before. It's something I've been looking for. Where is the legitimate historian interest in what Sean Ross, who is a popularizer, but not somebody that writes books or creates footnotes. His work is based on his own ability to show you things and visually and then to connect them together with his own vast knowledge. But to see an academic like Aaron Chaitkin write this, I think it adds a tremendous amount of weight to the idea that Switzerland, the secret little tiny quiet Switzerland, has been a active partner behind the scenes with British intelligence, and the ability that they had to affect things in the United States from the very beginning is the theme of this book. So we'll be talking some more about that as we continue reading it. I'll be reading the next section of this on Thursday. I have tomorrow reserved for a minefields, and looking forward to sharing my own thoughts tomorrow with you here at 11 a.m. So until then, I will say eek, 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 and thank you for being with us.